Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the May episode of the Forest Health Workshop series. Today, we are discussing timely tree treatments in the month of May, what you can expect to see in your gardens or in your windbreaks, and what you might expect to treat for your trees, keeping your trees healthy. I'm your moderator, Tony Seidel, Forest Health Program Coordinator, and joined as always, but this time in person, by Dr. John Ball, our Forest Health Specialist and SDSU Extension Forester. Dr. Ball will be discussing timely treatments for the month and the this time of the season, and we will have plenty of time for some questions after his discussion, his presentation. Keep in mind this webinar is being recorded. The recording will be placed on our YouTube playlist for further viewing, for later viewing. Any credentials for Society of American Foresters, Certified Foresters, or International Society of Arboriculture, Certified Arborists. Those credentials are only eligible for this live presentation today, the 15th. So stay tuned. At the end of our meeting, Dr. Ball will have have an ISA code for you. If you are an SAF certified forester, please put your credentials in the chat box. We'll make sure to get those submitted for you for your CEUs. If you have any questions that might arise, please put them in the chat box. We'll be happy to get to them as time allows towards the end of the meeting. And as always, thank you so much for joining us. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Ball.
All right. Well, thanks, Tony. And yeah, we're literally sitting across from each other. We may end up having to shut off our audio when one of the others talking, just so we don't get too much feed here. But appreciate you all being on today. I'm out in the Black Hills, obviously, working. It's raining out here. I'm sure it's raining in a lot of other areas, but not a lot of us are complaining about rain this year. So I'm going to see if we can kick this up and see if we can get her going. So we should be good, correct, Tony? And is it popping up or not? That's a good thing. Tony's sitting right there. Okay. Let me try it again here. It's okay. I'm going to go back to the Zoom here, and it says share. Okay, now we'll try it again here. Share. Good now? All right, folks, yesterday at the end of the day, Zoom took my computer and said needed to update. So might have a little hiccup here or there. But Tony will let me know. The beauty of it is I can look over his computer and see if he's seen it. So today's presentation is really about timely tree treatments in May. And the reason for that is a lot of us look at tree problems in July, August, September even, where the problem could have been corrected had somebody done something much earlier in the year. May's kind of a big month for that. There's a lot of problems that get started now that if you could actually treat them now, we wouldn't see the problem. So we'll see if we can get into some of those. So what I'm going to be focusing on today is these treatments from mid-May to early June. And some of the big ones are, for insecticides, would be emerald ash borer, again, if in a quarantine county, or adjacent. I say adjacent because Monday I was up to Fargo. And in Fargo, we did our first EAB workshop with all the companies, you know, the Rainbow, ArborJet, Arbor Systems, so they could demonstrate all their delivery systems and products for managing emerald ash borer, and why emerald ash borer has not been found in Fargo. You merely have to cross the river, and you can very much see, though they're removing them quite quickly, trees that have been infested by emerald ash borer in Moorhead. So that's why I say adjacent. There's a lot of people obviously doing treatments in Fargo just because the fact that they're they're confirmed just across the river. In South Dakota, this would be Union County, Lincoln County, and Minnehaha County. And quite frankly, no matter where you are in those counties, you probably should be treating, because I can find it in windbreaks and shelter belts and in a number of other areas as well. Union County, we have not found it in all little communities in Union County. It's more concentrated down in the south in the Dakota Dunes area, but they're at that park point, and then along the river, you can easily find infested trees. Some other insects that we have throughout the region, doesn't matter you're in North Dakota, South Dakota, adjacent Minnesota even, oyster shell scale and pine needle scale. And now we're coming up to a critical time period to treat those. And then for fungicides, it's the big three. You can see that they're all our evergreens here: spruce needlecast, Dothostroma, and Diplodia tip blight. So we'll kind of take them in order. I also want to point out, I checked the growing degree days, base 50, for this time. And at May 14th, we were at 290 for Aberdeen, about 240 in Fargo, 355 in Rapid City, and 400 in Sioux Falls. And so a lot of you watching this can kind of say, well, okay, I'm between these two, and get an idea. Obviously, you get up to Fargo, it's been a little cooler, as it always will be. And so they're a little behind what we're going to see in Sioux Falls. And if you're down in Dakota Dunes, you're a good 20 to 30 growing degree days above that even. So we always use growing degree days because it does tie in well for flowering. For example, in the Sioux Falls area, you are getting a nice bloom of all the common lilacs. In fact, that's even occurring up in Brookings and out here in the Rapid City area as well. Yet to really kick in up in Aberdeen, and certainly Fargo. I didn't see a lot of it when I was up there on Monday, but it's just about to start. They're at about 240. Well, before I even talk about pests, I do have to mention this one because the phone has been ringing. I've also been getting text messages and emails about people noticing the tops of their maple trees are a little late in leafing out. In other words, they notice that the lower half, the lower 2/3 are leafing out, but the upper third is a little bare or leafing out late. And once again, we're looking at desiccation injury. The calls have been primarily coming from eastern South Dakota, where we were in a drought for most of the year. In fact, if you're down south of Sioux Falls all the way to the river, it was under a very high drought, moderate to severe drought last year. And I was reminding people that maples, they need water. They absolutely need water, because if they go in winter dry, we will see desiccation injury. So we're seeing it again this year. Now, we're even seeing it as far north as Brookings and a little farther north, but it's not as severe as last year, where we had a lot of trees that by May, the top half was completely dead. What we're seeing more is bud damage, and the trees are rebudding. A good example is the birch in my own yard. Leafed out normally, except for about the upper quarter. But over the last couple of weeks, since the twigs survived, but we had some bud death, it's rebudded and it's coming along too. And what you're looking at here is a maple on our campus, an autumn blaze maple at South Dakota State University. And you can see that the top is filling in. Now, there are going to be some dead branches, and I am getting called, well, what can I spray? Nothing. Just a reminder that when it does go dry this year, you may want to begin watering. But what we're seeing this on mostly are maples, hackberry, and birch, and some black walnut as well. Those are the ones that seem to be suffering most from winter desiccation injuries. And by the way, they're the same ones that if you keep them in a cooler too long, will also suffer desiccation. So it fits, but no bug, no fungus. All it needed was water, but it needed it last fall. All right. Well, we did our last session on emerald ash borer, so I do want to point out that we are really rolling into the time period to treat the trees now. In some communities, such as Canton, South Dakota, they have suffered so much mortality that all the ash that isn't being treated, at least, need to come down by the end of this year, by November. And they've already developed these community tree brush disposal sites, and they are piled up with this. Now, what's interesting is I was standing out there taking a look at it, and one of the guys just dropped off the tree in his yard. And he said, well, I understand they have this insect in them. Look at the inside of that. All you could see were galleries. That was it. Galleries and pupae. So it was good this tree came down, but the town is pretty much infested, all the trees to a greater or lesser degree. So it just points out when we say, hey, emerald ash borer is in your community, you may want to start trading. You may want to start trading because 4 years later, it's really too late. And at that point, removals is probably what you're going to end up doing. Pupation begins at about 250 growing degree days. That means it starts forming that last stage before it emerges as adults. And we're right on target for this year. I expect the adults, which do begin emerging at 500 to 550 growing degree days, about when black locust blooms, to start showing up in the Sioux Falls area right after Memorial Day, which is just about what it's done since 2018. I expect it'll be a little bit sooner down in the Dakota Dunes area. And up in the Moorhead area, certainly it's going to be a little bit later. I would expect early June. Their case, when I was up there, the ash were just beginning to leaf out, where we're at almost full leaf in the Brookings and Sioux Falls area. And then the adults, when they start emerging about when black locust blooms, the peak emergence is when little leaf linden is in full leaf, little leaf linden, which is about 1,200 growing degree days. In the Sioux Falls area, that's about the 3rd week of June. So in other words, they start emerging at the end of May. About 3 weeks later, half of them that are going to emerge have already emerged. And then it tapers off very quickly by mid-July. Everybody that's going to fly that year has flown. They only live for about 4 weeks or is beginning to fly. And that's why we say we can still find adults flying into August, but not very many. A reminder to everybody, a log about the size of your forearm, that let's say was cut down from an infested tree this winter, you can have 12 adults emerge from that. And so we certainly don't want to see any wood moved out of quarantine areas, certainly nothing crossing the river up in Moorhead, and nothing leaving the quarantine counties of Lincoln, Minnehaha, Turner, or Union County, because even one small log is enough to start an infestation in another community. Oops. It died here for just a second. There we go. So treatments are starting up right now. That's why we did the workshop up in Fargo. You want to start doing the treatments as soon as the leaves begin to open. And the reason for that is on trees such as ash, they're ring porous. And as I mentioned last time, you've got to build the new plumbing system for the year. So all the new vessels that are going to carry the chemical are already set before it leaves out. So if you wait till leaf out to start doing your injections, you know that chemical is going to move. Now, how fast is it going to move? I thought I'd throw this one in. The chemical can move about 50 to 90 feet per hour for ring porous trees. So literally, you inject it on a nice sunny spring day, leaves are out, soils are moist, kind of conditions we're getting at this time of year. You might say, oh my goodness, that chemical is going to be taken up and distributed completely throughout the tree within an hour. No, water's going to move that quickly, not the chemical per se. So let's go over that for just a moment. When you start putting the chemical in the tree, and we've measured it in the canopy of the tree, both in the wood, in the inner bark where you're going to find the insect, and then also in the leaves, about a week later, you're actually having it move throughout the larger limbs in the canopy. And then by 2 weeks, it's out in the branches. And then by 3 weeks, it's out in the leaves and the smaller shoots. So my recommendation, and it does follow from the manufacturers of the products, anticipate 30 days for complete distribution of the active ingredient. That's the AI in the leaves, in the phloem. but it may be sooner. Okay, so you might get good distribution within 2 weeks. But that's the other reason like to see the chemicals get in right now, because we're a couple of weeks away from the adults emerging. Okay. When mom emerges, she's going to feed on leaves for about another week before she starts laying eggs. So if you get the chemical in now while the leaves are coming out, so you know the plumbing system is built, figure it's going to take about 3 weeks, possibly 4, for that chemical to get distributed throughout the entire canopy, all the foliage, which it's going to be in sooner, and then all the inner bark where the larvae will feed. That'll take a little bit longer, but within 30 days, you're going to have that tree completely protected. So if you got it now, that tree will be set by the time the adults are emerging and feeding on leaves and beginning to lay eggs. Remember, that's going to be probably about 10 days after you start seeing emergence at the end of May. All right, what's some other pests out there? I've been getting lots of pictures of pine needle scale. It's so easy to see, and it's been so nice. People are out walking around their yard. This is an armored scale, meaning it forms a very hard shell, does not produce honeydew like our soft scales, because this feeds in the tissue between the cells, does not tap directly into the phloem tissue where all the sugars are. So while it is pulling up sugars and such, it hasn't tapped directly into that phloem tissue, so you're not getting an excess flow, so you're not excreting it as honeydew. So these, it will not be sticky on that plant. There are some scales that do produce honeydew, tortoiseshell scale, for example, on pines. But on this one, no, you'll just see these white dots on it. Now for scales, right now, the eggs are underneath that hard shell of mom who is dead. Okay. And the eggs are beginning to hatch. So right now, we're at a stage where eggs are just beginning to hatch, and they're going to crawl out beneath their dead mom about Mother's Day. How's that for some irony? And the crawlers then are going to move out, scurry around as kids always do, and they're going to go to the newest growth, and then they're going to tap in and start sucking the sap, all right, from the tissue, from the needles and that. And on this picture, you can see the little crawlers. They've already started. Okay, we're past Mom's Day. And so the crawlers have moved out the shell from dead mom, and they're going to go moving out to the newest growth. The new needles are starting to open. They're the tastiest, and start living on the sap from that for the season. Then in the fall, that hardened shell of mom will be there, and eggs will be laid underneath. By the way, mom doesn't have to meet a guy to lay eggs, believe it or not, for this one. Mom can do it all along. You don't need males for pine needle scale. I won't talk any further about that because people could take it a lot farther. Maybe we don't need guys at all. In the insect world, they don't. All right. So what we want to do is treat now to kill the crawlers, the kids, before they do much damage, as kids do as they become teenagers. Look at that. This is a sample I just got in. Those are all pine needle scales, but keep in mind, every scale you look at there is dead. Nothing's alive. Mom doesn't move, all right, just has that hardened shell. But if you pull those away, you can still find some eggs underneath there that have not hatched yet. And if you put it under a microscope, you can find little crawlers moving out and going to the newer growth. And guess what? Pine needle scale is very bad at tree identification. So it not only attacks pines, it'll attack spruce trees as well. Now, oftentimes there's really no damage to the tree from all this injury. But in some cases, you do need to treat. But a reminder is that even though they can make a tree almost look flocked, almost white here, there has to be a lot of them to really harm the plant. Now, the first generation hatches about 300 to 500 growing degree days, about when common lilac is in bloom. And that's kind of what we use as our indicator that the eggs are hatching and now would be the time to treat. Now, again, it's between 300 to 500, so you want to wait a little bit. Let the kids go out and move around a bit. And then one treatment ought to kill them all, or at least most of them. You'll never kill every one of them. But you didn't need to spray right at 300. You can wait a little bit longer. So up in the Fargo area, you're not even thinking of treating yet. Even in Aberdeen, we've got to wait a bit. But if you're getting down to the Sioux Falls where they're at 400, yeah, you're at the perfect spot to get out there and do your treatments, because most of the eggs have hatched and you can kill a lot of kids. And so there's the life cycle there. Notice they do hatch over about a 2 to 3 week time period. The first crawlers are going to feed on a lot of the older needles and then become adults. And then the second generation will feed on a lot on the newer needles. It's the first generation you do want to manage, the ones that's going to feed on older needles and on some new needles. Some are, the new growth is already being pushed out. The second generation in August, we don't worry about. So you really want to focus on this first generation for treatments. The second generation is at about 1200 to about 1600, about when false spirea is blooming or when little leaf linden's flowering. But really, we focus on that first generation. We want to do our treatments after common lilac has bloomed. And I want to mention another scale. And this one I want to mention because if you drive through Pierre, South Dakota, you'd swear emerald ash borer is in almost all the trees because a lot of the ash have declined. But it's not due to emerald ash borer, it's due to oyster shell scale. And I find this a lot in the Rapid City area too. I'll stop and think, boy, that tree, maybe that's our first emerald ash borer tree in town, and go up and find, look at that bark. You can't even see the bark. The infestation is so heavy. And out here in the Rapid City area, you go to some of the little HOAs and that, and you'll find a lot of these aspen, and you'll spot one that, oh my gosh, it hasn't leafed out yet, or it's leafing out really sporadically. And you look at the bark, look at that bark. Now, by the way, every shell you see there isn't alive, because just like pine needle scale, the hardened shell is the adult, the female. And you can't really see the young as they're scurrying around. And by the way, on bark, there's shells there that might be 2, 3, 4 years old. In other words, there are no eggs coming out from underneath them. So quite often infestations will look heavier than what they are. Now, when you do get one this heavy, as I've seen in Rapid City, what you'll find is the bark cracking away on the aspens. Again, because they're sucking the sap directly out of the trunk as well. Now, for these, once again, they're going to hatch over several weeks. The crawlers are mobile for about a week, so you really want to make sure you get those treatments. And then the adults live for a brief period, and then, of course, the eggs overwinter. So in the case of the oyster shell scale, there is only one generation per year, not two, as we find pine needle scale. So it's really critical to get those treatments on fairly close to now, and so that you're able to kill the kids. For this, it's at about 550 growing degree days, about the time Miss Kim lilac blooms, or after black locust has bloomed. So this treatment starts, or they start hatching, I should say, about the time emerald ash borer starts to emerge. So we're giving you a heads up. For pine needle scale, get those treatments on now. For oyster shell scale, you got a couple of weeks, so plan on it. But about 550 growing degree days. Miss Kim lilac's very common in a lot of communities, so it's a good indicator as well. Now, in many cases, you don't need to treat at all. I'm serious on that. Most of our control for scales is actually done by everything that likes to eat them. And this is a spruce tree, as you can tell. And the ladybug larvae and their adults, this is the adult, were feeding on the pine needle scales. And the people called me and said, do we need to treat? No, you've got enough natural controls out here. Anything you spray is going to do a better job killing what's attacking them than killing them themselves. So I said, hold off. And guess what? There's the same spruce 2 years later. Yeah, you find a couple of old scales. Yeah, and you can find some new ones. But once the ladybug larvae and adults found the spruce or a couple of spruces, they really cleaned up the infestation. So let natural controls do the job if they can. So just live with them. You know, they're not going to do a lot of harm. You have to have an infestation about as heavy as what you're seeing in this picture before you really need to do any treatments. By the way, one common treatment is to scrub them off. Get a little scrubber like this you use for your dishes and scrub them off the trunk of your tree. I don't recommend that. The reason why is, remember, a lot of the scales you're going to find on the trunk of your aspen tree have been dead for years, and so that's aesthetics. And you're not going to scrub up there unless you get a toothbrush, all the branches and that. So this is what I call a retired guy treatment. If you have nothing to do between breakfast and supper, sure, go out and do it. Get you some exercise, you're out in the nice sunshine. But in terms of control, nothing, but you might get your neighbors wondering why you're out there scrubbing your trees during your day. Well, what about products? There are a lot of them. And I will say, for scales, this is something that's often best left to commercial applicators. They have a lot more chemistry that they can use. There are soil injections that can be done. There are trunk injections that can be done. And the trunk injections, the value of that is you're not going to kill a lot of other insects that may be feeding on the tree or just lighting on the tree. And so you're targeting the product a lot better by doing this. And we do have a couple, and I do want to give an important distinction. The Detiferon here, Safari is one of the product names. It can be injected. It will take several weeks to reach the canopy. Slower even on conifers because of their uptake system, but it's effective on armored scales. The two scales we talked about, oyster shell and pine needle scale, are armored scale. Imidacloprid, which is sold under a number of products, is not effective on your armored scale. Okay, for these, they take a little longer to get up into the tree, but for the scales that we're talking about, it doesn't work because the imidacloprid only moves through that sapwood there. And so unless they're sucking the sap directly out of the tissue, it's not going to reach them. So just keep in mind, imidacloprid does not work on your armored scales. Well, some other things that work, again, if you're going to have a commercial applicator do it, Distance, which is a growth regulator. I love this. It works great on crawlers because you know what the crawler has to do? It essentially has to burst out of its shell at each one of its molts. This keeps it from bursting out of its shell. All right, so you can see that's a fairly targeted product. Now, for homeowners, you can use insecticidal soaps and you can use horticultural oils. They do work. And if you say, John, I got a small tree, or you got a mugo pine, for example, and that's what you're concerned about with your pine needle scale, these do work. But I will tell you, read and follow label directions, kind of extension mantra. Why? Because these can actually damage plant materials if you're not careful. Insecticidal soaps, you'll notice they'll say mountain ash, buckeyes. Some say sycamores, which we don't have a lot of, so watch when you're applying those. And then for your oils, watch the temperature of the day. We've had a relatively cool spring so far, but you don't want to be applying them when it's too hot, or sometimes they cannot be mixed with fungicides. So you have to be kind of careful there. Read and follow the label direction. And I'll just mention briefly, yep, tent caterpillars are out and they're getting bigger. At this size, it's going to take a lot of product to kill them. We do have eastern tent caterpillars, essentially East River in South Dakota. Same with North Dakota. We have western tent caterpillars, West River, though believe it or not, I can find both in Pierre. And they feed the same, so that's not a big deal. And if you get up in the northeastern part of our state, South Dakota by that, or you get into North Dakota, in the forested areas, you will find forest tent caterpillars, which have this little kind of keyhole on the back. Now, eastern tent caterpillars and western tent caterpillars make about the same sort of nest, fairly large, thick cotton candy nest in the unions of the trees, in the branch unions, not on the tips. Those occur with our webworms, which are later on this year. Forest tent caterpillar has a much smaller and more wispier nest. But right now, when I'm out bicycling, for example, through Brookings County, I can see these nests building and getting bigger. Now, the best control is just rip the nest apart. And guess what? They lost their protection, and all the predators and parasitoids can get them. Plus, they lose that little humidity chamber that they like to live in. As they venture out during the day, they're still venturing back. Also, right now, they're vulnerable to an awful lot of insecticides, and that I would always suggest use one that is targeted as much as possible. We are not endorsing any products, but I will mention Captain Jack's Dead Bug Brew. If you read that one, Spinosad, which is a fermenting of a natural soil bacteria, does great for controlling this. But many of these products are stomach poisons. In other words, the insect has to eat them. It doesn't just have to walk through them. So don't be surprised if you apply one of these products and they're still wandering around for 2 days. They'll be dead in 4, and they have a stomach ache. And more importantly, they're not eating for those 4. But it's kind of a soft approach to doing these. Do not burn the nest. I can show you collateral damage where they burned half their crabapple down just to kill the insects. Yeah, this. Just tear them open. Right now, we have the larvae out feeding. They're more inside the nest than outside. But really, if you don't treat them in the next week, don't bother treating them. It's going to be more revenge spraying than anything else. They'll have done their damage. Well, a little bit on fungus. I'm going to talk about the big 3 because we have a lot of fungal diseases that need to be treated in the month of May for our conifers. Let's go over the needle cast diseases first. Astigmatia is one we find on Colorado blue spruce, probably our most popular spruce. It is the most popular spruce in our region. Its fruiting structures look like this. They have these little kind of like spider webs coming out of them, and you can see those now. And then we have Rhizosphaera, where you'll notice their fruiting structures are a little closed. There's a lot of products that can be used. Mancozeb, chlorothalonil are 2 of the common ones. Chlorothalonil can be bought as a lot of different products as well out there. Let's see, Daconil's one of the common ones that people buy at garden centers, for example. And you can treat small trees yourself, but again, larger trees are best treated by commercial applicators. But the reason we're talking about it is now's the time to treat. When the new needles have grown to about half their length, which is getting now in a lot of the areas, is when you want to get that first treatment on, and a second treatment in about 3 weeks later. Infection occurs during warm, wet weather. And guess what we're having right now in much of the region? Warm, wet weather. So right now, as the needles are about half open, spores are being released that will infect those new needles. So you need to get the treatments on now. And then a second treatment in about 3 weeks. Now, pardon my illustrations, but this is a spruce needle, all right? And that's a spore. And the spores are going to land on the needle. The spores can germinate and penetrate the tissue directly. And their hyphae is now going to penetrate the needle and cause an infection. The mycelium will grow out. And then guess what? By next year, that needle's turning kind of a purpley color. And we're having fruiting structures. That's that little black oval on the side there, which is now releasing spores, and the situation continues. If you apply a fungicide, it actually provides a protective film. And so when the spore lands, we're going to kill it. It's not going to germinate. It's not going to produce the hyphae. However, if you spray too late, if you say, oh, I'm seeing the damage this summer, I'll spray the needles, they aren't going to do anything. Most of our fungicides are really films to protect the tissue underneath. They don't have any effect once those spores have germinated and now the mycelium is within the needle. So timing is critical for these. It isn't going to work this summer. And the same's true with Dothastroma needle blight, and I italicized needle because this affects the needles directly. Once again, timing is critical, and we'll go over timing here in just a minute. By the way, I'm getting a lot of samples of this showing last year's needles. The new needles aren't out yet. But if you're finding this banding on the needles, that is a common symptom of Dothastroma. Now, I said symptom because banding can occur from a number of other problems. De-icing salts, for example, we can find it on. So it's probably one of our most misinterpreted symptoms. It's not always Dothastroma, but Dothastroma will cause this banding. Typically, too, the base of the needle will still be green. Everything above the banding to the tip will gradually turn brown and break off. When it breaks off, we kind of call those cigarette tips. Okay, so that banding is now that kind of that little gray at the tip. And yes, indeed, that's a good indicator that the tree was infected last year by Dothastroma. But the symptoms don't show up until late summer. Hence, you want to treat now as those new needles are coming out to protect those from becoming infected. Copper mancozeb works out great. For these, there's a lot of products that are available that contain this. You want to do it as the new growth is expanding. So you're going to want to watch those candles on pines. And as those new needles are forming, you want to treat it then. And then you're going to repeat in late June. Now, in some cases, if it's wet, you have to do another treatment in mid-July. But quite frankly, in almost all years, if you get that first treatment on, as those new needles are starting to come out of the candle, you're protecting those with that film, that chemical film, and then repeat it in late June as that film is wearing off, and particularly if it's still wet, that's going to be sufficient. But I'll tell you this, if you skip the first two treatments and say, oh, I'll start treating in mid-July, it doesn't matter. You've already got infection because you missed the first treatment and the second. The first treatment is always the most important. You don't want to miss that. And if you miss it, there's probably no reason to try for a second, and certainly not the third. Same is true with Diplodia tip blight. Now, boy, do we see a lot of that in the Black Hills region, primarily because we have a lot more hailstorms here. And a real important point is it isn't because the hail damages the tissue and now it can become infected, though that's certainly a factor. It's because the hail stresses the tree and the tree was already infected. With Diplodia, you are not going to stop an infection. You are going to reduce an infection. And so that's why we treat. Common symptom for this is a tip blight. So it affects the shoot, and the needles attached to that shoot are affected. Typically on a tree that's infested with Diplodia, you're going to find the top still green. If I'm driving through the Black Hills, I'll see the top of the pine trees look perfect. And then as you go further down, you'll see these tips affected. Now, once again, I do want to point out there's a number of other problems that people confuse with Diplodia. But I will say these are very common symptoms of Diplodia. If you look at a tree and the dead needles are hanging from stunted shoots, that's a pretty good indication that the tree has Diplodia. The new shoots are stunted. So you don't kill the tree because there's always side shoots that develop, but you'll find this on some of the laterals that are breaking bud, but the tips were stunted and killed. Oh, by the way, the disease also overwinters on the fallen cones. And sometimes you'll see a control measure of sweep up and destroy all the fallen cones. If all you're working on is your quarter-acre lot and you're surrounded by other pines that are dropping cones, you wasted your time. You got a little exercise out there raking in the fall. This also overwinters in the twigs, stunted twigs. So you'd have to prune those all too. So if you have the only pines within miles, sure, rake up the cones. Otherwise, don't worry about it. And I might point out that one of the things that I'm pleased we do, and Connie Tanny is on this as well, and she runs our diagnostic lab on campus, is we also do the second step, and we will go through and find the spores. Now, do we do that on every sample? No. Some are diagnostic. The sample very clearly is. But as I say, there's some things that can be confused with, so it's very valuable to go through and do that extra step and see if you can get spores, because spores are diagnostic. The spore will tell you exactly what it is. And this is something that we routinely do, and I'm pleased that our lab is one that we can do and do this additional step from time to time, just to make sure that Connie and I are not misdiagnosing just from symptoms. What do we use for this? Diplodia, chlorothalonil, copper, mancozeb, the big three, but we do have some others. However, treatment is as the bud begins to open. So this is usually early May. Now, it was a little cooler, so we're still in that window, except if you live down in Dakota Dunes. And that window hasn't even started when you get up into the Aberdeen and North Dakota area. But what are you doing? You're protecting that new tissue, and then you repeat again in 10 days. Now, we also have a product that can be injected into the fall, into the trunks of the trees. And so there is an injectable product. It's sold by ArborJet, and it's for commercial applicators, but it also is highly effective. And then a couple of other reminders as we're wrapping up today. If you've got pine wilt disease in one of your trees, and I've been getting pictures of that, people say, well, it seemed to die all of a sudden. Actually, it died last fall. You're just noticing it now because everything else is greening up. Those trees are usually, if they die that quickly, and it's a Scots pine or an Austrian pine, those two, Scots pines or Austrian pine, not ponderosa, then what you need to do for those trees is cut them down and burn them. Usually we'd like to have that out by April 1st. And the reason why is the Sawyer beetles that carry the nematode from one host to a new host are beginning to fly. You're usually pretty safe even doing it now. By safe, my point is, if you haven't done it yet, still do it. Do not cut those trees down that had pine wilt, the Scotch and Austrian that seem to die rather quickly, and then stack that for firewood somewhere else, because I can guarantee those pines were near where you stacked it are going to turn suddenly brown again this year because all you did was move the infestation. And last, we do have a couple of other problems out there. Chlorosis, because of our high pH soils. This is common on maples and birch and many oaks, not our common bur oak, fortunately. But it's all due to the high pH soils that have limited the availability of two microelements. If it's iron, it's on birch and oak. So if you notice that your swamp white oak, for example, or your pin oak has green veins and the leaf tissue is turning yellow, or on your river birch or your gray birch, you notice that thing, it needs iron. If it's a maple tree, it needs iron and manganese. An example I give is on this big silver maple in Sioux Falls. We tested for it, and that's what we found in the tissue, about 122 parts per million of iron, about 235 of manganese. That's what you need. So you can see it had a slight deficiency of iron. It had a major deficiency of manganese. And by the way, this is another one, particularly in a tree this size, that is best treated by a commercial applicator. And I've been encouraging commercial applicators to remember with maples, you better be adding manganese too, because just adding iron won't often green them up. And the manufacturer of the products mentioned that as well. But now is a good time to get the treatments in. Why? Because there's usually enough iron and manganese in the soil to get the leaves started, but not enough to move into the newer leaves. So if you have a tree that suffered from this chlorosis in the past, now's a good time to get an applicator out there, if you haven't already, to get those trees treated so they stay green this year. And so thanks for watching. That's my contact information where I can be reached. I work as a forest health specialist for South Dakota Department of Ag and Natural Resources. So I work with Tony, who's the forest health administrator, and we both go out and look at a lot of pest problems. But since I'm employed by South Dakota State University, I have a South Dakota State University email address, and my cell phone I carry all the time. It's off right now, but it's right behind me because that will ring all weekend. And then the last slide, the slide that is kind of important to some of you, and Tony had mentioned it, is the CU credits for ISA. Now, again, this is only important if you're an ISA certified arborist. But if you're an ISA certified arborist, and as Tony mentioned earlier, if you watch this live, not on later on this month or so, just while it's up on the web, you can submit it to ISA. Use this name exactly as we have it. Timely Treatments for May is what was submitted to ISA, and there is a code DS24-011. So if you watched it today, you can submit this to ISA, but using this title and that code, but only for ISA. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, turn it back to Tony here, and I'll shut off
my audio there.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ball. I don't see any questions in the chat right away, so maybe we'll give anybody a quick minute here to finish typing a thought or a question. But thank you, everybody, for joining us. Some great information as we enter the late spring, early summer season. Trees are developing quickly here in Rapid City. I'm sure they are around the rest of the state too. So we really appreciate everybody's time and focus on these critical time periods for treatment. I don't see any questions popping up, so looks like we're getting off easy with this one, Dr. Ball. Stay tuned, folks, for June. We'll send out our next flyer here in the coming weeks, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much.